You're going to lose muscle, I'm going to lose muscle, we're all going to lose muscle. But have you ever wondered exactly how it happens through your life? Well, this is the area of research that I specialise in, so I thought I'd do a video explaining it. And we're going to go through this year by year or decade by decade, starting from the very first decade of your life. In fact, even before that, because the number of muscle fibres that you have in your body and largely predicting how many you're going to have in later life is determined whilst you're still in the womb. Our muscle fibres themselves can grow, but largely they don't increase in number all too much. So the number of muscle fibres you're born with is important. And even at this early age, we do start to see differences in muscle mass between children. For example, children who are born lighter have lower muscle mass and lower strength, and that might seem fairly obvious, but this actually carries on into later life as well, even into their 60s, 70s and 80s. However, as we start to enter our childhood and teens, there are obviously lifestyle factors that become more involved, and this brings us on to our second decade of life, between ages 10 and 20. This is where to a certain degree you can start to fight against your genetics. For example, this one study asked thousands of Brazilian teenagers how much physical activity they did on a weekly basis. They then had each one of them do a DEXA scan, which essentially tells you how much muscle mass you have in your body, and they found that the amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity that these kids said they did correlated with the amount of lean mass that they had. And it's not only exercise, we also see that diet plays an important role at this stage of life. For example, this study here looked at 4,000 kids aged 8 years old, and they asked their parents to record how much protein they consume on a daily basis through their diet. They also had each of the kids do a DEXA scan, so they got a good idea of their muscle mass. 2 years later, they then followed these kids up when they were 10 years old, and even after accounting for the amount of physical activity that each kid did, the ones who were averaging higher protein intakes had a greater overall body weight, which was mostly explained by lean mass, than the kids who had a lower protein intake. However, for kids at this age, muscle mass is obviously still increasing as we develop. And that brings us on to our 20s, our third decade of life. Now, this is where the majority of scientific literature agrees that our muscle mass and strength levels seem to peak. That is in our late 20s and early 30s. And after that, we're sort of fighting against the natural aging process. In fact, there's a group of researchers based in Europe whose literal job is to research why we lose muscle as we age and how we can slow it as much as possible. And in their own words, they most recently said to prevent or delay muscle loss, the aim is to maximize muscle in youth and young adulthood. But what does the research tell us is the best way to go about this? Now, it may not surprise you that it is resistance training. So much so that if you compare resistance training to just doing absolutely nothing, the scientific evidence says that someone doing literally any amount of strength training, it's going to have a positive effect on their muscle mass and strength. Not only is it important for our muscles, but women might have a particular interest in strength training at this age. And this is because women are particularly susceptible to developing something called osteoporosis in later life. This is essentially when your bones become weak and it can be very easy to fracture them. Well, one of the biggest factors as to whether or not a woman is going to develop osteoporosis is in fact her bone mineral density in her 20s. And what is one of the most effective methods of increasing your bone mineral density yourself? Well, you guessed it, resistance training. So it turns out your 20s are actually pretty important in terms of setting up your muscle health and your general body health into your later life. Then we come to our 30s and 40s. And to be honest, this is where the decline starts. Now, don't worry, because it is very gradual at this point. If you're in your 30s or 40s at the moment, you probably might not even notice it. However, it is where we see certain age-related changes starting to creep in. For example, testosterone production naturally starts to slow at this age, and your muscles will also start to become slightly less sensitive to some of the anabolic stimuli, such as consuming protein in a meal and also resistance training. However, this period of life is where we start to see the people who resistance train regularly and the people who don't really separate out. In fact, during this period, if you are regularly training with weights, you can expect to pretty much maintain your muscle mass at least into your 30s and perhaps your 40s as well. But that does bring us on to our 50s and 60s, and this is where things start to get a little bit more bleak. At around age 50, this is where we start to see our muscle mass fall off a bit of a cliff if we do nothing about it. In fact, after age 50, your leg muscle mass is lost at a rate of 1 to 2% per year, and you can expect to lose whole body strength at a rate of 1.5 to 5% per year. However, again, all is not lost because resistance training still works at this age. For example, this study took men and women in their early 60s and they had them do a strength training program for 24 weeks. They measured their muscle size using MRI, which is a highly accurate way of doing it, and over the course of the study, the control group, who were asked to basically do nothing, saw a decrease in their thigh muscle size by 0.7%, whereas the group that were doing the strength training program, well, they gained 7%. And there are many more cases similar to this where resistance training has shown to have positive effects on our muscle mass even in later life. And now we move into our 70s and 80s. And this is where not only do we have to contend with age-related loss of muscle, but also some acute changes. What do I mean by that? Well, spending just a couple of weeks in hospital can have pretty drastic effects on your muscle size. As we all know, as we get older, we're at greater risk of certain diseases, but even in really young, healthy people, a study like this where they completely immobilized one leg for 5 days, usually by putting it in a cast, decreased their quadricep size by 3.5% and their quadricep strength by 9%. Now, in young people, this isn't necessarily a problem because this can usually be fully recovered in quite a short period of time. But in older people who are already subject to the effects of aging, as we've already talked about, this might not actually ever be fully recovered. So on that rather depressing note, I think I will finish with one take-home point. And if you take anything away from this video, I want it to be that you are in control of your muscle health, and that the single best way of maintaining that muscle health into later life is through regularly training with weights. It is absolutely inevitable that we are all going to lose muscle, but if you train effectively, this might not happen until your 50s. And even then, at that point, your rate of decline is going to be much slower than someone who is completely inactive. So what kind of training should you be doing? Well, that's a video for another day and is actually the topic of my next upcoming video, where we will look at what the latest science says about the most effective way to train to prevent muscle loss or at least slow it. So thanks very much for watching, everyone, and I will see you soon in another video.